violence is one of those issues that are very important to us, and something that we don't normally talk about openly. But it's a pleasure to be able to introduce Amelia and also Faye again, to be able to help us, lead us through different types of scenarios, and to question and to look at the way in which we might deal with family violence ourselves. So I'll pass on to Amelia.
So let me just say, my father migrated to Australia in 1963. I'm half Chinese, half Scottish Aussie. I grew up here in Sydney. But one of the things that we learned back then was that in the migrant communities, in the Asian communities, family violence was really common, it's really high. Partly because there are so many more stresses on a family when you don't have the family support from the home country, from being with your extended family. So that has been an area of interest for a long time. Many years ago, the World Council of Churches got involved in a campaign called Thursdays in Black. And I've got a little Thursdays in Black badge on. Well, this year, World Council of Churches and the World Methodist Council Executive that I'm a member of recommitted ourselves to Thursdays in Black, which is inviting all of our member churches around the world to have days of Thursdays where people wear black and encourage having a conversation about family violence and domestic violence, because it is so much more common than we know. One of the most important ways that we can change family violence is by the church offering good news and the way of Jesus Christ into our families. And so we need to learn as church leaders, how can we help communities combat the terrible things that have been happening even in this last few months. Some of you will have seen newspapers and heard news reports that there are so many people dying from family violence every week and suffering every day. But in our communities it happens, but we are too ashamed to talk about it. What happens at schools and universities, however, is that kids are encouraged to talk about it at school. So we actually know that it happens in many of our own communities. So we have asked today for the help of our young people to show you 3 different stories. They're stories that we all agreed are pretty common stories that many of us could recognise. They're not meant to single out any families, they're just common stories that we know. So may I have the first story?
Yeah, we're going to, so we have 3 different scenarios, and as we watch our young people perform these scenarios, we want you to think about how can you respond in a non-violent way, or how can you respond in a godly way. So just think about with regards to the scenarios that you're going to see. So we're going to have story number 1.
Oh yeah. Stories have been settings where our young people have identified that this kind of story can often lead to family violence. Okay, so yeah.
mà phải học mà lâu lắm. Mà bây giờ phải bé này quay nó come mà đấy là come mà đây đi à. Vô lên nó lên vậy mà.
Mana? Salah yang mau kemain lalu ikut doa. Ada Amelia? Kalau Nico?
Yesus.
Oka. Maths F, English F, Science F, Computers F. Kenapa kita ada F?
Very good.
Like three more friends. I want F. Huh? Do you want to see Jesus? Huh? Wait, you want to see Jesus? Huh? But then I am Jesus. It's somebody like, yeah, I am no focus. My mouth came.
Okay, look, kamu pakai dia lagi. Ôi kiri, ôi cần phải cái sốt. Vâng vậy không mấy đạo. Ôi mà hay nhất mấy nó đi. Yeah, well, oh my God. Oh my God, no. The map? Lality. Lality mình nghe lấy mệt á. The rugby team. Oh, okay. Alu kupe. Mayo bisa na ina mai ko. Ay mai mau kay me kel. Liam kel ka la. Kel train. Ha? Ha? Okay na mo no reo. Oh. Mai mau ma ko kay. Kay lo ko ma. Ay kay lo ko ma. Dwayne The Rock Johnson. I saw no happening. Oh God. Kilianga. It's a Amelia. Yeah, it's very cool. Go kikiale le aku jano le no.
Thing, you saw those different scenarios, okay? That's our first scenario. A family with different things happening. And can you imagine what often happens then is often that's when the people who we see in the drama, at least one of them starts hitting one of the others. Okay, we've seen it happen. That the kid who fails English because she can't spell very. Very starts with a V, F starts with an F, you know. So, gets hit because they failed. Or the kid who didn't get into the rugby team gets hit because he failed. The definition of violence isn't actually just physical violence. It's not just about being hit. It's any time we use power in a way that does harm to another person. Okay? And we see that there's a lot of harm happening in our communities. So I'd like you to have a think. Given each of those scenarios, what would be some of the ways that the scenario could be resolved without hitting, without violence? Ideas, yeah.
Ask the kids in the first instance what they wanted to do. Where do they see themselves future-wise? And then work together. Then the parents can support what the kids think they want and will do good at for the future.
Can we have playback theatre? So can we have Mum and Son, okay? Mum and Son, come back up here. Play out the
Música ka? Ai, ia. Wala ele foi na halfway ke experience. Ia wala lai, kama kakara mo plano si me kuma me I no musika. Ole ale ki kala, pole piano. Kama ia na me lai. E ka ona le fale roa. So ki kala na a.
Being a musician, I wanted to get it, right? How are you ever going to make money as a musician? Exactly. So one of the things that we need to help some of our congregations understand is what is the alternative to violence? Is there some other way that we could have a good outcome that doesn't involve hitting? Okay? Because a lot of the time they're turning to us for ideas and we're not actually talking about something other than what's going on at home. Okay? Should we see the second drama?
Okay. Oh! Hurry up! Wow, what do you mean? Oh, Amelia else. I'm okay. Why? You need a phone, I'm telling you. I'm just answering. Remember the last one? That's enough. Going back. I'm sorry for better than that. You listen? Huh? Huh?
You guys kind of give us chills when you do that. We recognise that, we see that, don't we? In our different places, we see that playing out a lot. Did you notice when they were acting that out, the body language, okay? So the body language of how the wife kept stepping away and how she actually shrunk. She got smaller. Did you notice that? I think most of the great husbands I know, they're happiest when their wife walks taller, not when they shrink. Okay? If we think about the imagery of Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride, I think that we imagine that God doesn't want us to be like this as church. God wants us to stand up and do the God thing. Yeah? Amen. Amen. So part of what we need to be teaching in our congregations is how do we help men and women to stand up to a power imbalance where people are less human. Whether they're men or they're women or children, if people become less human, they're not going to be as valuable for God. Okay? So we think, when we see a situation like that, it can involve violence. violence then. We could imagine doing a playback theatre and getting them to do a thing where there's a non-violent outcome to sorting themselves out. But I'm going to ask them to do, I'm going to ask you a different question. What would be a way where there could be a godly outcome? Not just a violent outcome, not just a non-violent outcome. What could be a godly outcome that was honouring to God? Any ideas?
A humble and quiet response
A humble and quiet response. From which one?
from the wife.
I'd want to say both.
And
From
for
both.
the husband to listen.
Yeah.
Because he never listened once to the wife and what she was trying to say.
So how we listen is really important, absolutely. And it's how both listen. Because I don't think either of them were listening. No.
It was zero.
Zero listening from either of them. Okay. Yeah.
I think you're not thinking too much.
You noticed that? Yeah, I noticed that.
Because I always do. I only count a couple. That's
No need to
So for some people, their behaviour starts to change after even a half a drink. Not for everybody, but for some people. And we hear the stories, it's okay to have 3 drinks, okay? But not for everybody. For some people, their behaviour is less self-control. Now what's the part of the scriptures that says that we should have self-control? The fruits of the Spirit have?
Galatians 5.
Yeah. Patience.
Love. Long suffering.
Humbleness. Self-control.
Kindness.
Okay. Now self-control goes out the window when you've had too much to drink. Whether it's alcohol or even, let me say, kava. So when people lose their self-control, they are more likely to act violently to one another instead of lovingly to one another. The fruits of the Spirit are not helped by having too much to drink. Yeah? How? Yeah.
Also, trying to keep true to the foundation of the word that you started with your partner, not cheating at the same time, and being respectful so it doesn't get to that point where she's like this.
Yeah.
You just keep reminding yourself that she was like this at one time, and the very first time that you loved her.
Yeah.
So maybe starting from before coming in the door, staying away from that and trying, instead of dressing up or go to church all the time, but you've got numbers and all these different things in your phone. I think that's another silent elephant that everyone tries to stay away from. Is infidelity sort of thing. You know you're doing the wrong thing, but you're still going to church thinking I am the right thing because I'm dressed the right way.
Yeah. And what happens when people don't see you is just as important as when people do see you. Yeah. How can I ask a question of you too? because you do work on stuff. What makes it helpful to you to have a godly life?
I think the foundation of the church is important as well. And also the environment that you're around. We find that we're in trial and error. I've never hit my wife. And maybe she's hit me a couple of times because I'm young, I would. But either way, we try to find a platform to say, right, let's just get rid of all the clutter and stuff and start again. And that's how it goes.
Do you have any strategies for when? Because every marriage, every couple has tensions at times. Right? We all do that, don't we? Yeah? We all have it. No. Do you have any strategies for what you do if things are getting a bit heated?
Walk away.
Walk away? Walk away? Okay. But then if you never address it, it just gets worse, doesn't it?
Yeah. Why to
And then talk about it.
And then talk about
Talk
it.
about it.
Sorry?
You have to compromise with your partner. It's a give and take. If the husband comes home and the meal's not cooked, it's not like
to come to this side and the women to come to this side. Okay? Men, you have a chat together here. Women, you have a chat together here. And I want to ask you, from each group, for at least 3 ideas. Now, this is the be more godly and not be violent. Okay? Because we know that would be a better way. I have heard, you've heard that I've been involved in a Samoan community, but I'm also now in a Fijian community. And I have heard people say, oh, but this is the Fijian way, or this is the Samoan. Okay? But it is not the godly way. Okay? It is not the godly way. Jesus steps in and stops people being violent. So we need to figure out how to do the godly way. Are there some ideas from this group? You were in wonderful conversations. And I saw people talking and nodding. What are some of the ideas from here? And something saying someone, what will tell me? It's okay.
What we were talking about is it's very simple. If you get abused with your wife and you're getting so frustrated and try to punch the wife, what we were talking about is just move away. Go for your car and drive away. But there's a proposition with that. The only reason if you drive away, you can smash on the road and you smash someone else on the road and you get in big trouble. And then we come to think of it, it's no good of going away, but to sort it out. Think and forgive your wife. Let's say prayer. God will help. The way I do it myself, I hold my wife's hand, I forgive you, I give you a gift.
Okay, they're all too shy to say a response, but I'm going to say a response as a female. Okay. Sometimes when my husband gets frustrated with me, sometimes I'm in the wrong and I need his forgiveness. If he tries to forgive me before I'm ready to be forgiven, that's a big no-no. Because if I don't realise I've done anything wrong, I'm not going to receive his forgiveness well. Okay? But sometimes, just occasionally, maybe 1 in 100 times, when my husband is frustrated with me, maybe he did something wrong. Maybe once. So then, if he forgives me, I'm going to get angry. Okay? So one of the things that we need to do then might be to find out, why are we getting so frustrated with each other? Let's start to name why we're getting frustrated. And maybe, like in most marriages, they have an expression in English that says it takes 2 to tango. Okay? Sometimes it takes 2 to make a marriage really work. I don't think so. I think it takes 3 to make a marriage really work. Okay? So the godly thing is to not just rely on what he thinks and what I think. The godly thing is to ask God to be involved in our conversation. Yeah. So, yes, I think the forgiveness in marriage, you guys have really hit it on the head. Forgiveness in marriage is a really important God gift. Really great God gift that you named there. Wonderful. What about you guys? Have you got a suggestion for godly marriage?
I sort of did really speak in our group, only because I don't have a partner. But I guess, in saying that, I feel with marriage, is you need to have God as the centre of your lives, both lives, and you need to have a prayerful life. I think the other thing, I did a Bible study for our youth group in regards to unity. So when you're married, you want to be in unity. And there's 4 attributes for that. Kindness, gentleness, patience, you need a lot of patience, but above all, love. So I guess that's what you need. Obviously the communication has been the big thing that we discussed, but I think those 4 attributes as well, you have a really good life. So when the rock finds me, that's what I want to give.
Okay. So, and all 4 of those were in that Galatians list of fruits of the Spirit, weren't they? Yeah. Okay. That's really good for godly marriage. To see each other as both children of God.
Yeah, not to see it, because I think that's what we have in our culture. I think it's always the man must love and the woman just to follow along and follow through. I think as we were talking, it was more just meeting each other eye to eye and saying that we want to do everything and anything, and God doing it.
So we ask our, and as sometimes I tell people in a wedding service, Jesus Christ would have died on a cross just for you and loves you fully and totally. You are a child of God. And Jesus Christ would have died on a cross just for you, and loves you and calls forth the best in you. Both of them. Jesus loves both of them. So how much more wonderful is it when God calls 2 of God's children together into a life? That is magnificent. Amen. Let's go. Explain the scenario.
This is the church scenario.
So I want to go out. If I ask Mum, you ask Mum.
Why should I ask?
She listens to you. Yeah, you go.
I see you. What? Why not?
Victoria's house.
Victoria. Who's Victoria?
Her dad is
Why do you need to go to Victoria's house?
She said,
At 10 o'clock?
she's finished work. Please, Mum, we have to go study.
Well, come in, Mike.
Okay.
Bye.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's church. Tomorrow's Holy Communion.
Yellow day. Thanks, Mum. Yeah, bye. Let's go. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Fala sobre futuro, irmão.
Hey, Malotti.
Fala.
Não,
Como é hoje?
olha, não vier no ficar. Olha, meu iPad.
Uma beleza de espiar, assim.
Não, peraí, mamãe. Netflix. E além de ligar, eu ir lá e a já foi. E eu, my daughter's thing.
Esse papinho, esse quem é Apple.
Oi?
Esse olha o papinho Apple. Esse papinho é no fundo.
Oh yeah, okay, for Friday. Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, cafe, cake. Oh yeah, go. Phil, I know something. What about all this? You come with the key off the bottom. I want the keys. Oh no, we'll go for your window. Watch out for my window. You go first. Hey! Hallelujah! Victoria. Victoria Street, or the city for Victoria. Why am I? You know what? I'm going to church today. Don't ruin me, okay? So get ready. Let's go to church.
The distribution of the Holy Communion.
Embarrassment. Look what the fingers can smell your alcohol. You know what God thinks about you people? Doesn't love you. If you're staying again, hola! I don't see you.
So one of the things about that skit is it also falls into causes of violence. One of the things that can happen is that even about church, people might get hit afterwards and beaten up afterwards because they've just been naughty. Right? But also, even the act of preventing someone having communion is a violent act. Okay? I remember being the minister at Turramurra Church up in northern Sydney, and we had a midweek communion service. And at this midweek communion service, earlier in the week, on the Monday, I had taken the youth group to go and clean up somebody's house because they were going to be evicted otherwise. Turns out the guy was a hoarder and an alcoholic. And his little unit was absolutely full of bottles. It was filthy. It was terrible. And the youth group, they cleaned the house, they washed the walls, they took out all of the bottles, they filled a big garbage skip with bottles. And the guy was grateful that we had gone to clean up his home. And then the following Wednesday, he came to midweek communion service. And I'm going, oh, great, he's turned over a new leaf, he's come back to church, he's come to communion. Waft of alcohol hit me that he'd come to communion drunk. And I had the cup, the little tramp cups, and I'm just about to serve him, and I'm stuck. I can't serve him communion. And then I remembered, I do not get to judge him. This is a child who is beloved of God. And if he's come here, even with his sin out in front of everybody, he is still seeking God's blessing in this moment, and I am not the person to withhold it. That's a hard thing for many of our families to hear, because they will feel like my own family felt. When you wear your shame, you bring shame on our whole family, or you bring shame on all Samoans, or you bring shame on everybody here. But no, Jesus Christ overcomes all of that. Okay? I want to ask you two why we're having this session. Why was it so important to have this session today? Okay? You tell me.
For me, we did a session with Unite social justice, on family violence. We did something like this, and we invited our Pacific Island people as a first pilot project in the Synod. So we sent out our invitations and we went and spoke to people about it, and they said they would come. And so we had about 150 people that said they would come to this event. In the end, all the Pacific Islanders decided to boycott it in the last minute and said to us, this is not a Pacific issue, this is an everyone issue. And that if we don't engage with the wider church, and if we continue to say it's an issue of our own people, then it's not a process that they wanted to be involved in. But I think deep down, growing up, I know that this is something that is very much alive in our own culture. And something that even us kids, when we get together, we used to sit in church and I would look at my friend's arm who was sitting next to me. There'd be like a mark, he got whipped by an extension cord. And then we'd look here and then we'd be showing each other our bruises, saying, oh, I got this because I got drunk, or I got this because I didn't marry, I got this because the sucker was half cooked. And it was something that we used to laugh at, like it was a joke to us, that, oh, my bruise is bigger than your bruise, which is bigger than your black eye. But then I began to think as I got older, there was something sad about that. That even on Facebook we have these memes that and all these different things that our parents hit us with from the set, like also to the vacuum thing, and say you would know this if you grew up in an island family, you know what these things are. And I mean, there's something sad about the humour that we bring around that. So for me, it's important for us to sort of name, why is it that we laugh as Samoans and Islanders or other people about these things of violence, these things that our parents used on us, or things that we've... And I think by laughing at it, we normalise it, like it's something that's normal. But really, there's something going on deep down. So that's why I think it was important to bring this to...
Yeah, thank you. I think the other thing that why we laugh is because it's a mechanism for us, because we know it's happened to us. And that's our mechanism to say, yeah, we get that, we understand, but we need to go to the next level.
Yesterday you were saying you really didn't want to do this session. Well, you knew it was important, but it was a really tough one to come to this one. Why?
I think it just comes down, it's pretty much what Fear was talking about. It comes down to growing up. I watched family members, I watched my uncles beat up their wives and their kids do the same. And to me it was the norm. That's part of who we are, because it was unloud. So we laugh, but really why I laugh here is really to cover my shame, my embarrassment. It's embarrassing to get home, but we just laugh it off because of the shame. But I think it's one of those issues, especially as Pacific Islanders, it's so hard to talk about. But as you grow older and you thinking growing up, it's the norm, that's what normally happens. But then if you look at it, especially myself, I've been working, when I work alongside young people and hearing about the suicide rates, caused by these kind of things, it really makes me think, wow, this is just something that people don't want to talk about because they don't know how to talk about it, and it's too embarrassing to talk about it. So hearing stories from people, this in cause of suicide, it's really made me think this is just not right. And I think the reason I was uncomfortable because I just people want to talk about it because it's just, to me, it's embarrassing.
Yeah. There are two symptoms worth naming. One, as people have said, the suicide rate, particularly amongst young islanders. But the other one is incarceration in prisons. In this congregation, in this place, I'm actually really pleased that you're here today because it's good for Auburn Tongans to They're not used to doing this in this way, so that's a good thing. So one of the members of the congregation here at Auburn Tongan is Reverend Now Austr, and he is the chaplain to Silverwater Prison. He tells me that the vast majority of islanders in prison are not there for theft, are not there for fraud, are not there for any other things except for the biggest single thing is family violence. In the women's prison, the vast majority of women who are in prison are either there for a drug offence, or they are there because they defended themselves and committed an act of violence in a domestic violence situation. So we worry about the number of young Pacific Islanders that are in prisons. If we don't address family violence, then that will continue to rise. I hope that today we've given you a few strategies for how you could have conversations in your own congregations about looking at what does God call us to do instead of just falling back onto the habits that have developed in some of our families. How can we be the person in our families who can be the safe person to encourage a more godly behaviour? So I'm just going to ask, Faye, would you pray for us as we go through this session?
I think we will stand up and around the circle and hold hands. Let us pray. Loving God, we thank you that you have been present in this space. Thank you that even though it has been a difficult conversation to talk about these kind of things, which really happen through our reality for each and every one of us. And we thank you, God, that we have you to fall back on, to help us and to guide us on how to respond as followers of Christ. Loving God, we recognize and acknowledge that family violence is something that we must go against. But we also recognize that you taught us the greatest commandment of all, and that is to love one another as you have first loved us. Lord, as your children, we thank you that no matter who we are, no matter what we do, that we are always loved by you. Loving God, we just lift our hearts to you and pray as followers of Christ, Lord, that we are able to speak up and to stand up for what is right, to stand up for you, Lord. Help us to respond in the way that you call each and every one of us to respond with love, to respond with the fruits of the Spirit, patience, self-control, joy, faithfulness. But most of all, Lord, we give you thanks that we have had the opportunity to speak and be vulnerable and to be able to share things that are really tough to talk about. We can share them, Lord, because we know that you are with us every step of the way. Lord, we pray and we lift up those who are incarcerated, those who suffer from violence. We lift them up to you, that you can teach us and give us the strength to be your hands and feet, to show your love to the world. Help us as a church family, to share the good news. So Lord, we give you thanks and praise that we are never alone.
while we're still here, thank you to the young people who made the skits. That comes out of their... And also one of the great things that came out of this assembly was the commitment of the Uniting Church, who made a statement on domestic violence to try to be at the forefront of talking about domestic violence in Australian society. So that falls on us to do that, particularly in the Samoan community in Australia. Let's sing together. Into my heart. Into my heart. Oh, into my heart. Lord Jesus. Come in today. Come in to stay. Come into my heart, Lord Jesus.
Amelia is now leaving us. We are going to have our worship now, our final communion, and before we break up. Oh, well, I'll be pushed here. Amelia, this is not really, in our culture, it's very good not to appreciate somebody's service and fellowship and love. So it's just a small token of appreciation for what you have shared with us today.
Actually, tell me if I'm going to use it. When we get a gift in the Uniting Church under the Code Ethics, we use it for something for the community. I'm actually going to use this towards producing the messages about Samoan culture for the university.